And before I said yes, I should have understood that he wanted me to talk about cosmological and teleological arguments. I have no idea if I'm even saying that right, much less, but hopefully we'll have a good study. There's some very interesting material for us to go over tonight as we continue to talk about Christian evidences. So last week, Drew took us through the introduction of the Christian story, talking about a creator who makes a perfect world, the kind of world that he calls good in Genesis 1. And so we'll take these big words and boil them down to something that is much simpler than this. But tonight, we are going to talk about this cosmological argument that says, why is there something instead of nothing, right? And so that's very fundamental to the idea of Christian evidences. Why is there something rather than nothing? And how did something get here? Was there ever just nothing? That's very important when it comes to trying to talk about the evidence of God and really fundamental things to this study. And then the second part of the lesson tonight, we are going to talk about the teleological argument. Why is there design in the world? And so how can there be design without a designer? And so that's going to be some of the fundamental things that we go through. We're going to talk about a lot of evidence for God and as the creator of the universe in both of these discussions. So that's what we'll go through tonight. All right. That slide wasn't supposed to be there. But the first part of the lesson is this cosmological argument. So just imagine that we were sitting here during class tonight, and all of a sudden this pew over here to my right levitated off the ground, flew across the building, and went out that window at 100 miles an hour. Everybody would be stunned, right? And after a moment of shock, what would our question be about that? It's our question about a lot of things. How did that happen, right? What caused that to happen? And so what if my response to you was, nothing caused it. Sometimes pews just levitate and fly around the building. You wouldn't have a lot of confidence in anything else I said for the rest of the night, would you? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Either I'm clueless, which I can be sometimes, or I'm a smart aleck, which I can be sometimes. But no one would really be satisfied with that answer. And the reason is because pews don't fly without a cause. And to dig a little deeper into that, let's talk a little bit about scientific law. So what's a scientific law? A scientific law is different than a law of our country, right? You guys remember Schoolhouse Rock? I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill. I loved that, sitting here on Capitol Hill. And he finally got to become a law. Those are laws of the land, and those are different than scientific laws. So, for instance, a law of the land may be, and I don't think it is, right? But it may be that the speed limit out here on 411 is 50 miles an hour. And so let's say that that's the case. And let's say we start having a lot of accidents out here on 411. And so we decide that, there's a group of concerned citizens, and they talk to the people who make traffic laws, and if that's at the state level for that highway or whatever, they get a group together, and the lawmakers decide to change that law. And they change that law, and then the speed limit becomes 40 miles an hour, right? That can happen with the laws of our country, the laws of the land. They can be amended, they can be modified, the people can decide, those in power, to make a change. But laws of science are different than that. Laws of science can't be voted on. They're always the same for all people and all places for all time. So, for instance, let's consider the law of gravity. There are some numbers and equations that go along with this. I remember from physics class, I think 9.8 meters per second. That's most of what I remember from physics class. It's been a minute, but the speed, the acceleration associated with gravity. And so that's part of a law. That's a constant that has to do with gravity here on Earth. So let's say I step off of the top of a 20-story building, and I'm gonna fall at that rate. Might be some things that matter about that, like friction and air and stuff, or whatever. But generally speaking, the end of that fall is not going to be soft or pleasant, right? If I step off the top of a great big building. So let's assume then that we have 1 million scientists who all get together at a big convention, and they decide we want to amend the law of gravity. And so they all take a vote. Everybody votes in favor of it because we all decide that if somebody steps off the top of a building, we don't want them to splat at the bottom of it. We'd rather that they just float gingerly down. And so we're going to modify that constant of that acceleration going down to the ground. And so they all 1 million to 0 vote. We're going to modify that constant. We're going to float to the ground. The law of gravity is changed, and they say, now we need a volunteer to test out the amended law of gravity, right? And so no one in their right mind, right, would volunteer to be the test subject for that amended law, right? And why is that? It's because scientific laws, like the law of gravity, can't be changed by people. We can study them, we can give them names, we can try to understand them better, but we cannot change them. So let's go back to this example of the pew flying across the church building and out the window. And so we know that just didn't happen by itself. If it did, maybe we would sing one more verse of the invitation song, right? Maybe somebody would decide that if things like that are happening, maybe we need to make a change. I don't know. But how do we know that things like that just don't happen by themselves? There's a scientific law called the law of cause and effect. For every effect, there has to be a cause. Now, the law of cause and effect says that for every effect that we see in nature, there has to be a cause that came before it or simultaneous to it that is greater than or equal to it. So a pew flying across the building is a material effect. And so since it has an effect, it must have a cause. And so let me illustrate this for just a second. Let's say that pew did what it did, and somebody said, how did that happen? And I say, well, I saw Jake over there, and right after class, after the announcements, I saw him pushing on that pew. And so I think he must have loosened that up, and for that reason, that pew levitated and flew out the window, right? And again, you would think sort of like, that's no better answer than there was no cause for it at all. And why is that? And the reason is that the law of cause and effect doesn't only say that there has to be a cause, but there has to be a sufficient cause. It has to be great enough. That law says that it has to be great enough to bring about the effect. And so that claim would be wrong. Let me give you another example. When I was a kid, I was about 10 years old, and we had a youth devo over at our house. And I was the kid in the group because my sister was 4 years older, right? So I was just there because I lived there. But there were all these teens, and so I was in hog heaven, right? Because there were all these older kids around. And, I finally got to go someplace that I always wanted to go, but I never got to go because my sister was older. If you're a younger brother or sister, you know what I'm talking about, right? You never got to go anywhere because your older sibling got to go everywhere because they were older. But we'll set that aside. So this night, everybody's out in the yard playing around. And Bootsy Lane, who was 4 or 5 years older than me, was one of the guys, funny name, nice guy, loved him, out in the yard, and they were all playing. And I hit him in the back of the neck with a rubber ball. And you may ask, why do I remember from 40 years ago that I hit Bootsy Lane in the back of the neck with a rubber ball? The next day, Bootsy went to the hospital in what do you call it when you're by yourself? He was put in, do what? Not ICU, but like you're put by yourself and like the nurses have to quarantine. There we go. Thanks. Sorry. It's been a long day. So Bootsy was put in quarantine with spinal meningitis. I was fully convinced that I had given Bootsy Lane spinal meningitis by hitting him in the back of the neck with a rubber ball. And I carried that guilt around for a little while until I confessed to my mom, I think I put Bootsy in the hospital, because I hit him in the back of the neck. And fortunately, there was someone there who understood, medical issues a little better than I did, and that rubber balls are not a cause of spinal meningitis. You have to have a cause that is related to the effect. And so just like that pew or the rubber ball, it has to be a cause that's sufficient in the law of cause and effect. Our little kids are awesome at gaining information about the law of cause and effect. And if they were like Jonathan was when he was little, a lot of this happened from the back seat of the car to the front of the car, right? Mama, where do peaches come from? Well, they come from a peach tree. Mama, where do peach trees come from? Well, they come from peaches. And then there's a big question, right? And there's a big circle of life kind of question going on there and some thinking. Our kids, they like to understand about cause and effect. Where does this come from? Where does that come from? And so all of that to set us up here. But why is the law of cause and effect important? It's important to us because the universe is an effect and it has to have a cause. So here we get back to the fundamental of Christian evidences. Some people claim that the universe created itself out of nothing, or maybe out of a dense object and there was an explosion. But if we're thinking logically, if there'd ever been a time when absolutely nothing existed, then there would be nothing now, because it is always true that nothing produces nothing. So if something exists now, which we're here, we see things all around us, there's all kinds of matter here, then something has always existed. So let's dig into our universe a little bit more. Our universe is a really big effect. And just to sort of put this in our minds, right? Sometimes we think in terms of like what's just around us, but to think about how big the universe really is. You may have studied some about this, but if you could travel as fast as the speed of light, that's 186,000 miles per second, it would take more than 93 billion years to go across our universe. The universe is enormous. Our universe contains approximately 100 billion galaxies, and the Milky Way, our galaxy is just one of those. If you could travel at the speed of light across the Milky Way, it would take 100,000 years to go across our galaxy. I mean, this is how big the creation is, right? That's the point we're really trying to make here. Our sun is just one star in the galaxy, but it's so big that it could house inside of it 1 million planets the size of Earth. It's that big. And so, and then there's other stars in the galaxy that are up to 1,700 times as big as the sun. So what's the point? There's not going to be a test about any of that, right? But the universe is huge, and it had to have a huge cause. It had to have a cause greater than or equal to itself for it to be able to happen. That's the law of cause and effect. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there's nothing in nature big enough for the universe to have been created by it. It had to be something outside of nature. So what is outside of nature? Outside of nature would be something that's supernatural, and that's God. And so only God, a God outside of nature, could bring the universe into existence. Genesis 1:1 tells us in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the first verse of the Bible gives us the only possible cause for the universe, God. In Genesis 17:1, God describes himself to Abram as Almighty. So what does it mean to be almighty? The almighty God. We say that often. It means that God can do anything that it takes force or might to do. So when we consider the universe and its massive size, we realize that the cause for it had to be all-powerful. Romans 1:20 says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the earth and the things that have been made." So when people look at the universe, if we choose to do so, it's easy for us to see the power of God in it, right? How many times do we talk about when we go and look at creation, and we're really, and Will talked about the lens that we look through things. If we're looking through a lens of faith, it's so easy to see God in what we see, right? You go and you see something fantastic like the Grand Canyon or a great mountain, the Rocky Mountains, and you just see those and it's like, no man, no accident, no nothing other than God could have created that. But that's when we look through that filter of faith when we do that. And so this is why, we have this study, because the filter of faith makes these things so easy. But when we're trying to bring someone into the faith, we need to, try to understand these things a little more deeply so that we can present a convincing argument to others that God really is out there and that God exists and that all the things that are talked about in the Bible scientifically all align, and that's what Christian evidence is all about. Psalm 19:1, David wrote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." So if we're thinking now, so if we agree that nothing could have created the universe except for God, and you're thinking for a minute like that kid in the back seat of the car, what do you say next? Well, then what caused God, right? That's the quizzical question, right? That comes next. What caused God? So if we say that every material effect has to have a cause, and we say that only God could have created the universe, then doesn't the law of cause and effect apply to God too? Well, it doesn't. And there's a single word in the law of cause and effect that helps us provide the answer to that question, and it's the word material, because the law of cause and effect has to do with material things. And so scientists formulated the law of cause and effect while studying the universe, and it's made out of matter. There's no science experiment in the world that can be performed on God, but we know that God is not matter. John 4:24 tells us clearly that God is a what? God's a spirit, right? And so the law of cause and effect doesn't apply to God. So science is far from understanding everything about the material world. They learn more about it all the time. And certainly we're all further from understanding about the eternal nature of God. There had to be a first cause, and God was and He is the only suitable one for the job. So the law of cause and effect is a scientifically established law that doesn't have any known exceptions. It's not something that was conjured up by creationists. It's something that's scientifically agreed to. The universe requires a non-material cause. Couldn't create itself out of nothing. And the non-material supernatural cause is God. So why is the universe here? Because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All right, let's move on and talk about the teleological argument. So why is there design in the world? I'm sure you've heard this kind of example before, maybe this exact example, but it helps to set the stage for this idea of design and why does design exist. It's somewhat like the pew example, right? But let's suppose that there was an explosion at the printers where this Bible was created, right? I know you've heard the printer example before. And the whole building shook and smoke filled the place and there was debris everywhere. And in the midst of all that chaos, when the smoke all cleared, there were 10,000 of these Bibles clearly that had been assembled in that explosion. They were in perfect rows. They were all together, ready to be shipped out. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Right? That wouldn't possibly happen, right? All there would be there in that explosion is debris and chaos. No rational person would believe a story like that, and it defies everything we know about the natural world where we exist. And you know where I'm going with that, right, is the theories that exist about explosion and all the order and design that exist in the world. They just don't align well with one another because of the design of the world, and that's really this teleological argument that we're going to talk about. Man's observed thousands of random explosions on Earth. What can we say about them? They've never led to order. So we can conclude that explosions don't lead to order. What does the Big Bang Theory claim? That the perfectly designed Earth where we live is the result of a ball of matter or an explosion billions of years ago, and it just doesn't align with what we see in nature. Chaos doesn't lead to design. There's something called the Goldilocks principle that is applied to our universe. Our universe is amazingly organized. It runs better than any clock or machine that's ever been designed. In the study of the origin of the universe, cosmology, there's something called the Goldilocks principle. You know that story, Goldilocks and the three bears, Papa Bear's things never worked for Goldilocks, Mama Bear's never worked. Baby Bear's, everything was just right? It fit just right. That phrase, just right, describes how things in our universe fit together so that humans can live on Earth. And I want to share with you again, because we're talking about evidences, a number of things about how the universe is just right for us. And these things are always so amazing, right? We know these things. I'm not going to tell you anything new tonight, but just the way that the universe is assembled and the world fits together and the earth works within everything else. We just see the amazing power that God has in what he created. So first of all, let's talk for a minute about, let's talk about the orbit of the earth, right? Before we get into design, we'll stick here for a little while. So many years ago, scientists thought that our earth orbited the sun in a perfect circle. They, of course, have learned that that's not true, that it's more of an ellipse than it is a perfect circle. So what does an elliptical orbit mean about the distance between the earth and the sun? Well, if you know what an ellipse is, it's not the earth's not always the same distance away from the sun, right? Sometimes it's closer, and so because of that orbit, there is an adjustment that has to be made to make that shape as the earth goes around the sun. And so it just happens that that orbit is perfect for life to exist on Earth, and the Earth departs from a straight line in its orbit about 1/9 of an inch on average for every 18 miles it travels, right? Very small adjustment as you think about that orbit. in effect. That is hot. All right. So we talked about the Earth's orbit, the Earth's atmosphere, gravity. The moon also plays a huge role in life on Earth. And how is that? Well, the moon and the Earth's gravity pull on each other. And so the moon's pull on the Earth causes the movement of the oceans. I love to go watch the tide come in on the ocean, right? Don't you? I mean, it's just something about going to the ocean and watching those waves come in. But the moon's pull has everything to do with those tides and how they work. If not for the moon being an average of 240,000 miles from Earth, this just right movement of the ocean waters wouldn't be able to happen. It wouldn't cleanse the shoreline, wouldn't stir up the waters, wouldn't support the great amount of life, both in and out of the water. If the moon wasn't there, that water would get stagnant and a lot of life would cease to exist. It's all there in a perfect design. There must be a designer. Several thousand years ago, King David penned the words of Psalm 19 when he said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There's no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun." God told us through David that we can look to the heavens and we can examine them from afar and we can come to the right conclusion. There must be a creator of something so big and beautiful and incredibly designed. Hebrews 3:4 tells us, "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." People may decide not to believe in the master builder, but the evidence is there. The voice goes out through all the earth and their words to the end of the world. So the design of the universe presents a great challenge to the atheists. A few years ago, there was a prominent atheist scientist who wrote these words, "Like baby bear's porridge in the story of Goldilocks, our universe seems just right for life. It looks as if a super intellect has been monkeying with physics." We know what the super intellect is, right? It's God. So if the physical laws of the universe simply evolved to their current status by choice and random processes, we have to ask ourselves, why is the universe so finely tuned? How can astronomers predict with amazing accuracy where Mars is going to be 20 years from now? How can we pilot and guide spaceships from the Earth to the moon, knowing where the moon's going to be when both are in motion, right? I mean, it's because of the design. The Earth looks as if a super intellect lies behind the precise and fine-tuned and law-driven process, because God is that super intellect behind it all. So just as laws demand lawgivers and architecture demands architects, a finely tuned universe demands a designer. And so the argument for God is logically sound. We can know without a doubt that God exists if for no other reason than the universe's design demands a designer. Now, we've got about 12 minutes left, I think. And for the time that we can, I always enjoy these examples of just in small ways, right? We've talked about big things tonight. We've talked about the Earth and the Earth's orbit and the Earth's atmosphere. Big things, how big the universe is. And I think the other part of this that's so beautiful to talk about is to talk about God's creation in small things. And so as we talk about the design in nature, that's what I want to share. For the time that we have left, we'll go as far as we can. Just give you some examples here of just amazing, small, intricate design when we look at things like animals and just things that exist in nature. Romans 1:20 says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and design nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." And so God's word tells us that it's through his creation that we can see his power and his glory. The fact is, amazing design in nature, notably in the animal kingdom, testifies loud and clear about our designer. That's a crazy looking animal there, a cuttlefish. Let me tell you a little bit about the cuttlefish, just in terms of the amazing way that God designed this animal. So the cuttlefish have feeding tentacles that shoot out of its mouth, sort of like those birthday party blowers, where you blow into and all the things go out like that. That's sort of what a cuttlefish can do. Its blood is bluish green, and its ink is black. And so it can eject a cloud of black ink into the water to distract attackers long enough for them to escape, for a cuttlefish to get away. But perhaps its most amazing feature is the ability of the cuttlefish to blend in with its surroundings. And you may think, well, you're just about to tell me that it can change colors, and that's part of it, but that's not everything about a cuttlefish. A cuttlefish can actually change the texture of its skin to mimic the shape of certain rocks or corals that it's around in the ocean. And they can also move their body into a variety of different positions. So you look at that picture, when a cuttlefish is swimming around in large seaweed, it can mimic the grass's motion with those tentacles, arms, whatever, right? Excuse me. When in a study a few years ago, scientists placed cuttlefish in some different tanks with stripes, some horizontal stripes, some vertical stripes painted on different tanks. Well, this may be something about this spot, right? I don't know. But in that experiment that they did, what they learned was in the tanks that had horizontal stripes, the cuttlefish would position themselves in a horizontal way. If there were vertical stripes there, at least an arm would go up. There's these inherent ways that this fish can protect itself. And I mentioned, I'm about to tell you that it can change its color, because it can, right? But that was not the only cool thing about it. But a cuttlefish can change the color of its entire body in the blink of an eye. It can send signal from its brain to its pigment sacs to change to a different color. It can hide from other sea life by changing to the color of the sand or seaweed. It can even appear as a strobe light, blinking on and off very quickly, probably to confuse predators. So these are remarkable creatures. So if evolution is real, how did the cuttlefish evolve pigment sacs that can produce a variety of colors? Scientists, at least some scientists, believe that cuttlefish are colorblind. So how can a colorblind cuttlefish figure out how to change to the right color to protect itself based on its surroundings, right? It can't. It has to do with the designer, right? And so there's no real logical answers to those questions, because the cuttlefish was designed by a supernatural creator. God is the designer of the cuttlefish. Geckos are pretty cool, other than just, they're cool because they get to be on insurance commercials, but for other reasons as well, right? And so the gecko is loaded with some great design as well. Probably the first part of this, none of this is really surprising, right? But what happens if you grab a gecko by the tail? It comes off, right? Jim said it comes off, and so that's one of the protection mechanisms that God designed for the gecko, is that when a predator catches a gecko by the tail, the lizard contracts its tail muscles in such a way that the tailbone breaks. The gecko can get away while the predator's holding the detached part of the tail. And then amazingly, over the next few months, the gecko grows a new tail, complete with tough tissue, muscles, and scales. Another really cool attribute about the gecko is, if you've seen enough of them, you can see them crawling up walls and on ceilings, right? And it has to do with its arms and its tentacles. Geckos have 5 toes on each of 4 feet, and those toes can point in almost any direction. And on each toe, there's thousands of hair-like structures called setae. We're probably not saying that right, just trust me. And on each of those setae, there are tiny structures called spatulas that are called that because they look like spatulas. But all of that together, according to scientists, allow geckos to attach to almost any surface and be able to climb walls and stay on ceilings and stick on ceilings. And there have even, that design has been used in things like different kinds of tapes that can be reused over and over, but none of that can be, I mean, it's really cool stuff, right, based on that design, but whose design was it? It was God's design that is the perfect version of that. As Isaiah 40:28 describes God, the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator to the ends of the earth, was the mastermind behind that creation. Let's try to do 2 more if we've got time. Bar-tailed Godwit. A few years ago, scientists fitted 16 of these shorebirds with satellite transmitters. And one of the birds made it from New Zealand to Alaska in just over 3 months, flying over 9,000 miles with one layover on the North Korea-China border, right? That'd be a scary place to be. I'd get out of there too if I landed there. After nearly 4 months in Alaska, the Godwit started its flight back home to New Zealand. It flew uninterrupted from Alaska to New Zealand in 9 days without stopping. It traveled an average of 34.8 miles per hour. This Godwit weighs typically right around 1 pound. Without a compass or the Waze app, this bird made it back home in 9 days, a 16,500 mile round trip, and it ended exactly where it began. Now that's pretty amazing. So we can't understand this bird's stamina, and we can't understand its sense of direction. Evolution can't really describe how a bird could end up with this design. But Job 39:26 says, the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south. Jeremiah 8:7 says, even the stork in the heavens know her times, and the turtle doves, swallow, and crane keep the time of their coming. The Bible talks about the migration of birds and how that works. They know these things because the all-knowing, all-powerful God is the creator of them all. Last one. The mallee fowl. This is a chicken-sized bird, lives in the mallee forest of southern Australia. The mallee is a type of eucalyptus plant. So before the hen lays their eggs, the male will spend several weeks or months designing a special mound where the eggs will incubate. The male digs a hole about 3 feet deep and 10 to 15 feet in diameter. Nest. Hole using twigs, dirt, and sand. Eventually that mound gets up to about 5 feet. The hen lays 20 to 35 eggs in that hole over a period of several weeks. And so then the male keeps a close watch of the eggs in the mound and ensures that everything stays right around 92 degrees. So how does he do this? By sticking his beak and his tongue into the mound, the bird can tell if the temperature is too high or too low. If the temperature is too high, he can scrape away some of the mound to make it cooler. He can add things if it's too cool. But designed into this male bird is a thermometer, right? And so, it's taken us a long time, and we still are perfecting thermometers, right? I grew up in this age, right, where you had to shake it and put it under your arm or under your tongue, right? Now you go into the doctor's office, they just sort of run it by you, right? And so we perfected that. But God designed into this bird a thermometer, And it's used in this process, right? It's used in the incubation of the eggs. And so, where could that built-in thermometer really have come from? Could a non-intelligent evolutionary process give the bird this ability? Common sense would tell us this functional design required a designer. So closing up, Isaiah once wrote about being allowed to see a vision of the throne of God. In Isaiah chapter 6, it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." So what was the basis of that praise of God from the angelic beings? The whole earth is full of his glory. The beauty and the splendor and the design of God's creation should draw us closer to God. It should make us stand in awe of him. It should make us desire to worship him. There are all kinds of other reasons that we do, but when we see the majesty of the world around us, it should draw us closer to God, to want to follow him because he's the Almighty God. So I hope you found that interesting. That really takes us through those 2 arguments, the argument about something coming from nothing, and the argument about design. And Drew will pick up from here next week. Thanks.